On my first and only night in Italy, I found myself in bed with a would-be rapist I'll call Procrustes. Procrustes, you may remember, is the monster from Greek mythology who cut travelers to fit his bed. If they were too tall, he'd chop off their legs. And if they were too short, he'd stretch them on the rack. For 3 months, I'd been traveling alone in Europe on my first tour overseas. I was 23 years old, and I had been heeding the advice of a veteran solo traveler I met at the beginning who said, "Never let a man buy you anything because he will always want something in return." And I had heeded her for those 3 months, and now it was the eve of my departure for Greece, which I had saved for last, as in saving the best for last, because I was in love with mythology, and Classics 101 was my favorite course in college. And I was tired, I was lonely, I was depressed. And so when this travel agent with his lovely English sold me my ticket for the next day to Patras and invited me to dinner, I said yes. So there I was later, not that much later, in his bed, and I started to cry. And he said, "Be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. My mother's next door." And I cried harder and louder, and he let me out of the trap. And I ran to the dock, the pier, to wait for my boat in the morning, thanking the gods that his mother lived next door. On the boat at dawn across the Aegean, I felt hollowed out, stupid, really angry with myself. I blamed myself. Interestingly, I did not blame Procrustes. And it was on that boat that I saw the German for the first time. He had dark red hair. He was with a woman and 2 children. And it seemed he spent the whole trip arguing in English and German and Greek with the passport control. And he must have won his argument because when we arrived in Patras, everybody got off the boat and they disappeared into the crowd. I didn't know if I could go on. I felt maybe I had to go home because I didn't know if I could deal. But then I thought, if I left now, then this Italian would have ruined Greece for me, and I didn't want to give him that power. So I stayed in Athens for a couple of days, thinking I was going to be in this mythological place, and instead it was one of the most polluted cities in the world. This was 1983. And then somebody stole all my money from my hotel room. And I thought, well, maybe I really should go home, back to the States. But I looked in my guidebooks, and it said, on the island of Crete, it was always summer, and on Crete, the gods still roamed. So I took the 12-hour boat ride to Heraklion. And there, this hotel proprietress in her harpy-like way told me it wasn't winter yet, and therefore there was no heat and no hot water, and it was so cold. It was even colder somehow than Athens. And I felt full of despair, and I went into the only warm place I could find, a bakery, and I was sitting there drinking tea, and the bells on the door tinkled, and in walked the German. And he walked right over to me, and he said, "I see you are suffering." He said, "Is it money or something?" And then he touched the material on his elbow. He said, "Because if it is money or something, this is easy to fix." I shook my head. He said, "No," and sighed. I knew it was the other. And then he stood up and he said, "Come with me. I have an errand to do on the other side of the island." And I went with him, somehow feeling this stranger would protect me. And that was an instinct I followed, as I had not followed the instinct that told me to get away from the travel agent in Brindisi. On the back of his motorbike, I found that his body radiated heat. He was like fire and kept me incredibly warm, though it was getting colder and stormier. We stopped at a church he said he wanted to show me. And now we were far away from Heraclean and tourists and people who spoke English and signs in English. And we went into the church, and I had my camera. I was photographing all these beautiful things, icons, 6-foot-tall candles made of beeswax by the monks. And I kind of lost myself in the beauty of this church. And then he reappeared, and he said, come on, we got to go. And he kind of pulls me by the elbow back out to the motorbike, and he's looking around like we were being chased or something. But nobody was chasing us. And we got back on the bike, and shortly we were at our destination, which was the beach on the other side of the island. And it was stormy, a rocky kind of beach. And he said, "I need you to help me look for something. It's a rock like this big, and it's got these protrusions like horns." And of course I thought of the Minotaur, who was the monster on Crete who had terrorized the men and women by taking human sacrifices every year. And I found the rock, and he said, "Oh, I knew you would help me find it. I knew you'd help me find it." And then he gets down on his hands and knees, and he starts digging with his hands. And then he unearthed a box wrapped in plastic. And then he unwrapped the plastic, opened the box. It was like the size of a shoebox. And inside were crosses and gold and silver and jewels and little icons. And he said, "I am a thief, you see." And then he took off his knapsack and emptied it out onto the plastic. And it was everything he had stolen from the church we had just been in. And he said, "The Greeks are foolish people. They believe that God can be found in things." He said, "I will melt the gold and silver and sell the icons on the black market in Germany. This is how I feed my family." And I found it hard to believe what he said, though the proof was in front of my eyes. And then he said, "All right, we're going back to Heraclean now. And if anybody stops us, you just say I picked you up hitchhiking, you don't know anything. And we have to stop at this place where I left something last year." And he said, "I have to introduce you as my wife, because to do otherwise would invite suspicion." So we stopped at this kind of humble home, and there's an older woman and her two older daughters, and they came, and this was all in Greek. And they welcomed him like he was that proverbial god in his mortal disguise. And they wanted us to stay and to eat and to drink with them. And he said, no, he was sorry we had to get back to our children who were waiting for us back in Athens. And did they perhaps have the clothing he had left there last year? And they came out with the clothing, like pants and a shirt, folded and pressed, and sort of were holding it like an offering. And he put it into his knapsack, and then we left. On the road, it started to hail. And we saw multiple accidents. It was dark. And I wondered if that was going to be my end on the back of a motorbike on the outskirts of Heraklion. But we made it back to the hotel, where the Harpy proprietress was surprised to discover my Greek-speaking husband. And he argued and argued with her. And when they finished the argument, the heat was turned on, and the hot water was turned on. And he took a shower, and I saw while he was in the shower that he had dumped out multiple passports, all with his photograph, all with different names. And I knew he had really told me the truth. And he came back out and he said, I know you are suffering, but you will heal, he said. The Godhead is in us and around us, not in things. And then he touched the material on my elbow. That was the first and only time that he touched me. And then he was gone. The next day, the sun came out. And I went to the palace of Knossos, which was one of the places I had really wanted to go, for the ruins. And I saw there that what had once been the walls of the labyrinth to hold in the monster, the Minotaur, the famous labyrinth built by Daedalus, the engineer, were now like this high, a few inches, and it really didn't look like a maze anymore, and it certainly couldn't keep anybody in or out. And you remember Daedalus took his son Icarus into the center. He built his way into the center, and then they would fly out on the wings of wax. And Icarus did not listen to his father's advice. Flew too close to the sun, his wings melted and drowned, and that was the Icarian Sea I had named after Icarus I had seen the day before. And it was warm, and I started taking off layers. And I fell asleep. And for the first time since Procrustes, I dreamed a dreamless sleep. And I awoke to something rustling in the woods next to me, and I grabbed a rock, and I thought, this time I am not going to be passive. And I turned, and there was a pair of rabbits, and they had all their skin and fur, and they were running down the hill. Thank you.